I've lived a very unusual life. And that unusual life allowed me to have access to materials that most people, even if they live to 80 or 90 years, will never have the time to read. Unless they have some benefactor that's paying for their lifestyle and they ain't got to pay bills and they ain't got to do anything but read and write all day. That person may read more than I did. But if they don't have that, it's very difficult for me to believe that anybody would be more well-read. It's just not possible. 26 years in prison, not having a job, not having to pay bills, not having to travel to go get my food, not having to do anything, but every single day reading, writing, redacting, editing, getting books published, securing publishing contracts, writing people all over the world, getting libraries to send me books, using my own money to procure manuscripts that I otherwise couldn't have got, having benefactors that sent me so much of this material, and the wide wealth of old books that are floating through the 116 prisons of Texas. When I was a librarian, I had access to all of them. And this benefit I now freely provide on my Archaics channel and on my Archaics website, archaics.com. All this material, I can never say that, hey man, I'm the originator of this material. Within the context of a lot of the things that I reveal, I am the originator. I did put patterns together. I show mathematical patterns in history, but the core fundamentals of the Archaics research, all I'm doing is resurrecting things that have already been known, but have been suppressed because we have a certain ethnic group today who is basically censoring all education in the world. This is why most of this information has not been known.
How many books do you think that you've read in your life?
That's a tricky question. I have 1,357 nonfiction reference works, translations, ancient texts, and books that are listed for everybody to read on my channel. I have them on my channel fully listed. Anybody can screenshot those, blow them up, read them and all that. I have a whole video about my bibliography. But that's just the 1,357 that I actually wrote down the title of publication, the date of publication, the author, publisher, and all that. There's many that I lost. I forgot, pages that I've lost. I don't know. It's in the thousands. I have a 510-page thesis called Chronicon, where I have taken 41 different calendars from the ancient and modern world and synthesized them all into one single timeline that shows you what the date is for every year and all the events that happened on that day. And I reveal a lot of mathematical mysteries showing that there is no way that all this could be true. Yes, we have the sources that these things happened at this time. Yes, it lines up with all these other contemporary sources. We can prove that these things happened at this time. But mathematically, they can't make sense. This is all too perfectly structured. Therefore, the history of the world is a part of a construct. And a construct necessarily implies that these things were not predicted, but caused at certain times. Institutions like the Smithsonian Institute went into overdrive, destroying fossils and evidence of all these things that were going on in antiquity. And all these earlier writers, these fantastic writers that were putting out, I cite them all. I do videos on them. I show their books. I open the books up, show the bibliographies. I show all these things off. Man, it's fascinating that all this data was already known in the 1880s, 1890s, all the way up until 1920, 1930. It was absolutely amazing that the history of the world had already been put together. And then World War I hit. Then the Bolsheviks took over. Then World War II came in. And then the absolute iron fist dominion of the Bolsheviks over the entire body politic of the world was exemplified for everybody in the Nuremberg trials. Once that happened in 1946, we have been controlled. All our universities, all of our media, all of our educational, all of our Hollywood, everything is absolutely controlled through Bolshevik filters. I have data sets that would blow your mind about what the ancient Greeks said about these people and what these people were doing in the Mediterranean 300 years BC. The Romans were epic administrators. The Old Testament was a record of how the Jews imposed themselves on the history of the world. Not that the history of the world happened the way the Jews tell us. That's not what the Old Testament is. The Old Testament is the Jews putting themselves in all these historical events that did not belong to them. They belonged to the Israelites. They belonged to the Phoenicians. They belonged to the Israelite cousin-related peoples called the Ionians. They belonged to the Greeks, the Achaeans, the people of Argos, the people of Knossos, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans. These are all Israelite descended peoples, they all come through the branch of Brahma and Saraswati. The original story is Vedic. It is not Old Testament. The Jews were the ones that copied that and invented Abraham and Sarah. But the actual true history is Brahma and Saraswati. So I hope that answers your question. What you're asking me is true. It is very historical, but you've got to separate all the Jewish elements that are fiction and go back to the core materials. The original Jesus story was the Gospel of Marcion. The Gospel of Marcion was adapted from a Samaritan play. This is why when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's highly visual. And when you pay attention to the details of the Gospel, you find entrances of exits of actors. You see it all in your mind. You see the stage props, everything. Everything in the Gospel story is compressed into about a 4-hour presentation that was shown in a Greek amphitheater in Samaria. And they used to watch these presentations, and there'd be a crowd of people, and there'd be about 20 people in the stage, and they would watch all this stuff on the life of Jesus. It was later written into a text called the Gospel of Marcion. Gospel of Marcion was later used by the Roman Church to create the Book of Mark. Book of Mark was used to create the Book of Luke. Then Gnostic records were used, Gospel of Thomas and others, to create a Gnostic gospel. It was called the Book of John. This is why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are nothing like the Book of John. There's 4 Gospels, but they're not the same. There are intimate details in John that do not match Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this has widely been known. For over 150 years, scholars have been putting books out about this anomaly. Now, well, and what's interesting, though, is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John have all this accretions attached to it that are not in the Gospel of Marcion. And the Gospel of Marcion was almost 50 years before any of those ever appeared in the historical record. In the Gospel of Marcion, we have Jesus coming from the East. When he came from the East, he had these profound teachings. He spoke in parables and dark sayings. He was feared, man, because of the things that were coming out of his mouth. But the Gospel of Marcion doesn't have a virgin birth. It doesn't have any miracles, no raising the dead. Gospel of Marcion about the life of Jesus doesn't have anything about a crucifixion, the sun darkening earthquake episode and all that stuff. He was just killed. He was just killed. Now, it's the same principle applies to Brahmanism. The original ideas and concepts, a lot was attached by the Dravidians after the Aryans left the area and no longer protected the integrity of their scriptures. Brahmanism is fascinating, though, because it's the origin of many Old Testament stories. I'll give you an example. In Brahmanism, the god is Brahma and Saraswati, and they were half related. Same thing we find in Genesis with Abram and Sarah. Abram and Sarah were half related. The stories about Brahma parallel many of the things that we find about Brahma and Saraswati parallels Abraham and Sarah in the Old Testament. We find this over and over, these parallels. As a matter of fact, I read a book from about 80 years ago that cites no less than an entire chapter of details paralleling Brahma and Saraswati with Abram and Sarah, all the way down, all the parallels going. I couldn't believe it when I read it. I was like, what? This is amazing. So, but there's a lot of elements like that. Throughout the Old Testament, scholars have broken down and compartmentalized sections of the Old Testament and show where this came from an Egyptian funerary text, where this came from an Amorite word syllabary, where this came from an Akkadian epic about Sargon. Moses in a basket in a river was stolen straight out the Sargon epic. But we have this over and over. There was no King David of the Jews. They wish there was, because that was an old Jewish lie trying to impose authority over the Israelites they hated. The Israelite holy city was never Jerusalem. It was Kadesh in the north. Archaeologists know this, but the Christian world pushes a different story. They have to. They're trying to believe in the whole Judaic version of history, which is false. Now, these huge sections in the Old Testament are easily identifiable from many texts from the ancient world. They were Jewish borrowings. Most of them were done in the 5th century BC. And historians, even in the days of the early Christian fathers, were already accusing the early Christian church of plagiarizing these texts and stealing this material out of older Alexandrian records that had nothing to do with the Jesus story. All of these accretions were added David comes from a Ugaritic tale of Davidu, the giant slayer. King Solomon comes, you remember the Jews were captive in Persia for a long time, ancient Iran. Well, King Solomon wasn't real either. It's nothing but a Persian title for Suleiman the Great. They stole that too. And the whole history of King Solomon comes straight out of the Persian Empire. So all throughout the Old Testament, man, scholars have identified all this stuff that's absolutely fiction. But it's the Jewish versions of history that are fiction, not the Israelite. There's two different versions of stories running through the entire thread of the Old Testament. Two different creation accounts, two different flood accounts, two different Davidic kingdom accounts, two different Solomon accounts. We have, the accounts, two different versions run all throughout the Old Testament because it's two different perspectives. One was the Jewish Levitical prescribed perspective. One of them was the Aaronic Israelite perspective. And the Israelites and the Jews were always at war. Native Americans have the best memories and traditions about the world when the sun did not exist. It was only the moon and an ocean of water that floated in the sky, which magnified the stars in the heavens. But it was the time of the dark purple light, and it was enough ambient radiation that filtered in through this that animals, people, flora, and fauna grew to astonishing sizes. Humans have lived in a completely tropical world where there was no ice at the poles at all. The entire world was tropical, and the animals, insects, amphibians, reptiles grew to astonishing sizes. We have also lived, and I have many videos on this showing the scientific reports, that we have also lived under a vapor canopy like Venus has. And the conditions of our world were fundamentally different under the vapor canopy. In fact, at the exact same time, we also had gigantic mammals. We had gigantic marsupials. So when everything in the world is gigantic, and when we look in the coal seams that have been found all around the world, and we find the evidence of absolutely gigantic trees, mushrooms that have been petrified that are 14 feet high. Scientists in the 1990s built a biosphere in Glen Rose, Texas, and they replicated the vapor canopy conditions. These vapor canopy conditions they replicated instantly made fruit flies, cockroaches, lizards, amphibians grow to about 3 times their normal size. They also lived 3 times longer in the biosphere. They created a new atmospheric pressure. They replicated the dark purple light that is described in ancient times. They replicated all the conditions, increased the nitrogen and oxygen in the biosphere, because that's what the vapor canopy would do. The vapor canopy created a worldwide greenhouse effect. This is the world that is painted to us in the traditions. This is the world that has been replicated in Glen Rose, Texas, inside of a scientific biosphere. So there's nothing theoretical about it. It's just that people have a hard time divorcing themselves from a paradigm by which our educational institutions have brainwashed us into believing this whole geological 65 million year crap. So when that condensation came down, what was left was enough water droplets in the mesosphere to magnify the heavens. Now we have a gigantic ancient magnifying glass, allowing the matriarchal societies that were existing before the flood to look up and see stars, patterns, and all kinds of luminaries that we cannot see with the naked eye today. Year 2239 BC, the collapse of the vapor canopy, what the Bible calls the Great Flood, which the ancient Nordic peoples of Europe called the day the sky fell, and ancient Americans claim that it began the sun calendars, because when the vapor canopy collapsed, then the sun was seen for the first time. No one had seen the sun before. That's why all the older timekeeping systems are stellar and lunar, and they're matriarchal. But as soon as this grand, massive cataclysm happened, everything from that point after is patriarchal. All the matriarchies lost their power. And I say this all the time on my channel. It only takes us 200 years to go from horse and buggy to Hadron Collider. Taking that into consideration, if we have 58 centuries of recorded history, I don't want to trigger anybody. I didn't say history. I said recorded history. This is actual dates on steels, on temple walls, on cuneiform tablets, date markers and traditions, that we have 58 centuries of recorded history, and yet it only takes us 200 years to get, then this necessarily implies we've been technologically advanced a few times. And that fact is what answers many of the enigmas and mysteries that have been found in the archaeological record. What I do is I try to find all these things that are anomalous and mysterious throughout antiquity and our history, and show you that, look, there is a patterning here. This patterning is indicative of artificiality. Therefore, these are not random events. And if we follow the evidence through the chain of custody as we have received it, then the ultimate conclusion must be that we live in a scripted artificial reality where we have a lot of freedom to do what we want to do inside of this construct, but the construct is real. It is there. It's heading in a certain direction, and it's made up of events that are already going to occur no matter what we do. But where we're going to be in our coordinates inside this construct has everything to do with us on the personal level. So basically, the whole theme to my channel is that you're living in two different realities. One is for the collective and one is for the individual.